Great. Hopefully this sets us up. It's trying. Hopefully my internet is stable. Okay, guys. Hey, everybody in the chat. Good to see you. We're going to jump right into this. Here we go. Boom. I'm going to hit record. Okay, I hear one little echo. Might that be Bear?
That was me.
Okay, here we go. And boom, we're back for another episode of AlphaCast. I'm Mike Winner, and I'm here as always with my good buddy, Dr. Bear Paul Lando, coming to you live and direct. Well, I'm not in the great state of Jefferson today. I'm down south, but we come to you live always every week at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, where Bear is still up in the great state of Jefferson, where freedom still reigns supreme up on the Smith River. I'm down in sunny Santa Barbara, enjoying, as we were saying before the show, a little bit of respite with my wife, celebrating our 17th wedding anniversary. But that doesn't stop us from doing AlphaCast, because this information that we put out every week is so important, as is this week's show, is extremely important. And we did not want to, take some time off. I can do the show and then hit the beach after. So excited to have Kevin Annett on today. Bear, anything housekeeping wise before we bring the guest on?
No, I'm just really excited and truly honored to have Kevin with us today and spend time. So let's get right into it.
Wonderful. Well, we titled this "One Man with Courage Makes a Majority." And isn't that the case? And hopefully today's show will inspire more to find that courage deep down inside to make a difference in your own community. Our discussion on this episode will involve, just this is a bit of a trigger warning, will involve some unpleasant but documented subject matter pertaining to unspeakable actions taken by both state and church actors against Native American populations and the worldwide child trafficking industry. We will refrain from any graphic detail, but strongly feel the only solution for this abject cruelty to be the disinfectant of widespread truth. Kevin Annett has been a figure in the Native American rights struggle for many years, often working alongside Native tribes to expose corruption, abuse, racism, and historical injustices. A pastor with anthropological training, Annett lived briefly in a native village in northern British Columbia, which afforded him an intimate view of the poverty and lifestyle of indigenous Canadian communities. He encountered anecdotal oral histories of the atrocities, which were corroborated by archival documents he discovered when studying for a PhD, an endeavor which was revoked due to a sudden pullback on funding for Native historical research. What do you know? Although this seems suspicious, Annett notes that cover-ups are an integral part of church law, in which taking up an issue outside of church authorities could lead to excommunication. He actualized these concerns while employed for the St. Andrew's United Canadian Church and made Native rights a focal point of his sermons and community work. His focus on church abuses perpetrated on Native children led to his firing in 1995, and what he describes as a campaign of personal attacks against him led by the church and state, which ensued in an attempt to slander his research and deflect from the historical realities he brought to light. While Annett recognizes that his work is surrounded by a sea of controversy, he notes that he has yet to meet an individual who could show any degree of proof to refute his claims. Among Annett's main declaration is the assertion that the Canadian Church has assisted in the mass killing of Native children at residential schools, a claim that was officially supported with documentation in 2015. In Unrelenting and Murder by Decree, Kevin exposes genocide and child torture by his own Canadian culture and his personal struggle to force a buried truth into the light of day to prosecute church and state for their unspeakable crimes against the innocent. Join us in this very special episode to hear a firsthand account of the heroic efforts of Reverend Kevin D. Annett and how this award-winning author, broadcaster, filmmaker, and human rights figure stood down the forces of evil. Dr. Bear Lando, please take it away, my friend.
Great. Kevin, it truly is an honor to have you here today, and thank you for making time for us. We feel it's very important to bring certain truths to the light. We started ourselves, because of my background, just bringing more attention to certain things, we'll say, going on in the medical and pharmaceutical industry. And that's what got us out there. But ever since, we bring on guests like yourself to expose, other things in other arenas, because it's really incumbent upon us to make the changes we want to see in the world. And, the truth does win out in the end. Lately, we've had a number of guests who are really going into what's going on in Hawaii, with the native population and missing children and so forth. So, what you uncovered, of course, is a microcosm of what's going on everywhere. And many people know of your work already. We'll make all of your work available in the show notes and speak on it today. But maybe if you'd like to just do a brief introduction, maybe a recap, and I know it's a lot to ask in the short time we have, but then if we could go in immediately to some of the other things we're speaking on off air about the Vatican and certain things that are coming to light there, and just kind of bring us up to date real quick. So thank you again for spending time with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure, especially with the level of censorship these days. We appreciate media like yourself. Mike gave a good background. Of course, it goes back 30 years, so I don't want to talk about everything, but what I first began to uncover in Canada eventually blossomed into a whole movement that forced out official recognition by government and church, but at the same time, a corresponding cover-up. So, for example, yesterday in Canada, they have this thing called Truth and Reconciliation Day, which is quite the opposite of what it is. It's a complete whitewash of what actually happened. The government and the churches, when we began to expose these things, set up their own truth commission. So in other words, I often say it's like the serial killer appointing the judge and jury at his own trial, because they investigated themselves, which under international law is a no-no. When you've been involved in deliberate genocide, you don't investigate the crime and establish reparations. I mean, that's an obstruction of justice. But Canada got away with it. Even the New York Times quoted it in 2015 as this, revelation of these. They didn't call them crimes. They used soft language like cultural abuse to describe the fact that half of these children who went to these death camps they call residential schools, half of them never came back. That's a death rate double that of Auschwitz. And yet they never call it genocide in Canada. They kind of, so it's the standard thing you get in any regime that's committed these crimes. They co-opt the issue. They normalize it, they decriminalize it. Nobody is ever going to jail for the death of any of these children, 60,000 or more, right? But all of that, although it looked at first like a defeat, it was actually a catapult that launched us into even broader issues, which you've alluded to, having to do with the Vatican. After I got pretty much blacklisted and censored out of Canada, after the quote official apology in 2008, which pretty much just indemnified the churches and government that prevented them from ever being sued or face any responsibility for these things. After that, I got invited to Europe in 2010 by survivors of very similar crimes that happened all over the place. And, I said that when I met these folks in Dublin, Ireland, and where we set up our first international tribunal to look into these crimes, I was sitting there with them listening to their stories. And I said, this is like sitting among a bunch of indigenous people on the West Coast, the same atrocities, the same cover-up, the same church and state doing it, right? So I said, look, we've got to be united across borders, just the way, you're dealing with the oldest multinational corporation in the world called the Church of Rome, and we need to be united. And that's really what started this whole impetus that you see all over the world now of common law courts, survivors establishing their own inquiries, recognizing there's a common, monster at work here. It's really an extension of the human slave trade, child trafficking. And it's got big actors, a lot of major banks. We've located a lot of connections between big pharma and the medical genocide that went on all over the world, including in the Indian hospitals in Canada and America, where children were brought in, used in drug testing experiments, all sorts of other military-based experiments involving microchipping, bioweaponry, all of that stuff. And the more we begin to uncover this, the more enemies we begin to make at very high places. So there's always a price to pay for bringing this out, especially when you're a grassroots movement. But when you endure long enough in this, you learn a lot of important lessons. You learn how to navigate these bigger institutions, which are actually a lot more vulnerable than people think, because they're guilty and they know it, and so they can overreact. I mean, it only took 24 of us protesting in Canada to force out an issue that neither church nor state wanted to talk about, and that is the deliberate extermination of generations of children. Right? So this led to a whole series of things, including what's happening now this last few months in Europe, which is the International Common Law Court of Justice, which was convened under international law originally back in 2012. We brought charges against the Queen of England and Pope Benedict at the time, Joseph Ratzinger. And in fact, we helped force Ratzinger out of office after we notified various European governments about the charges against him. The Spanish government told him that he might face arrest if he ever came to Spain. 6 days later, he resigns, along with 3 other cardinals named in our indictment. And so it shows you the power of citizen-led inquiries. And that's what we want to kind of instill in people. And that's why I've written a lot of books like this common law training manual about how to set up your own courts. This one, which we sold a lot of copies recently, Dethroning a Rogue Power, why the Vatican needs to be expelled from the United Nations as a criminal body. Things like that is teaching a whole new generation of people that, like John Adams said in the American Revolution, it's only when the law resides in the hands of the people that you can have a truly responsible government, because it has to be a watchdog on the inevitable concentration of power and corruption that comes out of that. So right now, this court case that the ICLCJ has convened has to do with a lot of very conclusive evidence that the latest Pope brought in, Robert Prevost from America. He also is deeply implicated in what's called the Ninth Circle, which is something we uncovered from Vatican sources, from eyewitness survivors. This is a sacrificial cult going back many centuries. There's references to it in Vatican library archives and documents. We've even uncovered a log showing the location and dates and names of participants of these rituals going back to 1869, although it's much earlier than that. So this court case is being convened, and the verdict is actually coming out this coming week. And it's quite revolutionary, because they're not only naming the heads of these church organizations, but heads of state, and including one of them being Mark Rutte, who's head of NATO, who, as president of the Netherlands, he was seen numerous times at these Ninth Circle rituals. He used his office to conceal a lot of evidence and the names of the participants. We've had numerous eyewitnesses go on to describe, witnessing these things. It isn't just ritual sacrifice of children, which is a very old practice coming out of Rome, going back thousands of years. It also involves things like human hunting parties, and other very grisly things, which we don't have to describe in too much detail. I'll leave it. I hope people can't even imagine these things, but it involves these top heads of state, government, and that. So, I mean, these days with NATO and Russia rattling sabers at each other, it's a very explosive thing to be naming the head of NATO as, complicit in these crimes against children and others. So, I mean, there's more to it. We can get into the details. It'll be posted this coming week at our website, murderbydecree.com. But that kind of gives you a general sense of where this saga has led me personally, but how it's had an amazing ripple effect all over the world, really.
Are there countries, in your opinion, such as Russia, that are trying to oppose this? Or is every major country involved?
You mean oppose the crimes or the court?
Yes, opposed to the crimes. Like you mentioned NATO, we understand the nexus between, all the Western countries, and obvious reasons why they're ganging up on certain other countries. So are there countries actually standing against this, and that's why they're being targeted?
Officially, as a matter of fact, I mentioned in the first case that forced Ratzinger out of office in 2013, we had the support of the Spanish government. because until the next year, 2014, Spain had the right to try human rights cases from anywhere in the world. If you remember General Pinochet, the dictator from Chile, charges were being brought against him in a Spanish court. And in fact, the judge who helped do that, his name was Garzon, Balthazar Garzon, Spanish judge. He was an advisor to our court and remains so. But he was forced off the bench because he tried to prosecute Pinochet and the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church has had a long history of trafficking children in military regimes like the Franco dictatorship. The former Pope Francis, Jorge Bergoglio, did it with the Argentine military junta during the Dirty Wars, when the military were throwing priests and nuns out of helicopters, who they considered too left-wing. Bergoglio was good friends with General Videla and all these other guys, and he did this typical kind of whitewashing of the regime and helped traffic children being, of the prisoners in the general's jails. So I would say from experience, there isn't any regime that isn't in some way involved in this, because don't forget, human trafficking in that is a very lucrative industry. We had an example of that in the present Attorney General, Pam Bondi, is a former lobbyist for the private prisons, GEO and these other companies. Well, they make a lot of money trafficking people into prisons. In fact, we found that people who are targeted for deportation, in fact, often aren't deported from America. They're simply put into the private prison system where they're a cash cow. And it's one of the reasons we think the Trump regime, he made a point of separating children all the time, if you remember, at immigration centers. Those children are then trafficked. And, there's that whole connection. So frankly, I can't imagine any government in the world not wanting to get in on it. It's like the arms race or whatever. They're all playing the game. And so, it's true that your enemy of your enemy can be your friend at certain moments, like Spain was. We ultimately don't rely on governments. We invite observers and everything to our events and to our courts and other things. But ultimately, we're a citizen-led movement, because that's where really our power lies in the community, for people to go in and confront these child killers and stop them. Right?
Yeah, here in California, prisons are subsidized and, at the top of the financial markets as far as moneymakers, and also have deals with the prison industry to make sure to keep their occupancy 100%. And some of our work in the past, going into, you mentioned common law, but unrelated subjects where we're trying to bring truth into the judicial system, we find that every incarcerated person makes millions of dollars for the industry. So do you see anything going on beneficial or positive, speaking, in the U.S., or is the Donald just the same old thing? We have our own opinions, but we're open to any ideas.
There's one of the Proverbs in the Bible says, "Put not your trust in princes," and that's always been an operating principle for me, because priests and politicians will always say what people need to hear and want to hear. That's no basis to judge somebody, right? That's why our mandate in the tribunal from the very beginning, the International Tribunal of Crimes of Church and State, our mandate was to not only prosecute those responsible, but the systems of power responsible. So like on international law now, you can only try individuals for genocide, like Slobodan Milosevic, for example. Only twice in the history of the UN Convention on Genocide has it ever actually been applied. And that was in Rwanda and Serbia, which are not Western powers. They're not really allied with the West. They're either hostile or kind of on the margins. When in fact, all the major Western nations should be tried for genocide, and especially the Vatican, which has led it historically from the very beginning over the centuries. So yeah, it's really it's harder in a way at first for people to imagine, like, we the people doing this, because we're raised to be dependent, to look to the systems of power, to think we have no power. But the reason we like to shine the spotlight on what we've been doing for these last few decades is it shows you that if you're consistent and you have the right evidence and you never give up, they back off. They're like the little man behind the big mask. They have a lot more to lose than we do. And so I said, one of the books I wrote is this whistleblower manual. And it tells you what to do when you're under attack. Because as a big institution, church, government, corporations, they can only act in certain ways. There's a set protocol. But as in any guerrilla movement, we can outmaneuver them all the time and do unpredictable things, which is an example of that is in Canada, we began occupying churches on Sunday morning. We just go in peacefully and stand there. Within a few weeks of us doing that, the government started to buckle, and the churches panicked because, when you're up against a big corporation, there's two things where they're vulnerable. Their Achilles heel are their public image and their money. So when you go in and threaten the collection plate on Sunday morning, they all began to talk about apologies and doing the right thing after that, right? So, I mean, you have to think in terms of like what's laid out in the Art of War, which we often refer to in our work, where your power is very much about perception. And if the enemy perceives you have more power, you can be a small number and you can move mountains. And we've been able to do that in practice. So we like to hold that up as an example to help train people and organize them in the communities to stop these crimes and reclaim really the law in their own nation and their families.
So you're talking about sort of the court of public perception, and using media and like what we're doing today, this sort of evolving decentralized media, right? Where it's kind of funny. You look at like the traditional conventional institutions like CNN and these cable networks, they are plummeting in terms of their viewership. And if you were to just look at and we do have an issue with the quote unquote alternative media being hijacked, that's for sure. But I do, Bear and I talk about this a lot. Like if you just factor in all these little shows like what we do here and really put that together, I think that's a really positive and very, it's a good thing to see where this is going, right, Kevin? And I know you do a lot of these shows. So it's kind of funny, like you're seeing the cracks in the media. Like there's this show called 1923 that was on the AMC network by Tyler Sheridan. And one of the main characters is a Native American who, I don't know if you're familiar with the show, but she is being ritualistically abused in a Catholic school. And she actually ends up fighting back, and she's being raped by one of the nuns, and she ends up fighting back and killing one of the nuns and goes on sort of an escape, and they're searching for her. But they allude to the fact that they show all these graves there with all these natives that have been killed. So that's Tyler Sheridan is known to be sort of a conservative filmmaker here in the States. So I always thought that was a really good sign that at least even in more mainstream pop culture, this truth is getting out there now.
Right. Well, especially about the graves, like there's Canada's done this incredible Orwellian mind swabbing about our own history. And in 30 years, I've seen it go from no awareness of this to a great awareness as we expose this through our campaign, and then bearing the truth again in a very effective way. Because frankly, a lot of quote white Canadians and even a lot of Native people don't want the truth coming out. Now they're claiming that no graves exist, and I say to people, well, your own records show over 60,000 children died, so where did the bodies go? We know in a lot of cases they were incinerated. We found letters from principals saying we're incinerating them, throwing them in furnace. We have Irene Fable, a Native woman from Saskatchewan, describes in one of her videos her watching a priest throwing a newborn baby into a furnace in Saskatchewan, right? And these atrocities are like, when you look at them, if you go to murderbydecree.com, it's all documented there. That was my original research that we had to put up online because all the books kept disappearing from Canadian libraries. But what we learned was that the things like sterilization programs, where if you were an indigenous person and you wouldn't go to church, you got a red tag and they put you under the x-ray machine, like in Auschwitz, right? And just sterilized you. The whole Kenny Quatel, my friend in Campbell River, that happened to him and all 5 of his brothers because they were smart and they started talking about their language. So sterilize them. They're not allowed to breathe. I mean, that's one of the main definitions of genocide under international law. You're trying to exterminate a group by not letting them breathe. That's now become a practice. We found sterilizing agents in a lot of the vaccines being forced on Native people, because still in Canada, under the Indian Act, you can't refuse medical treatment. It was kind of like a COVID regime as early as 1874. If you refuse medical treatment, you go to jail or worse. And we know that Big Pharma were using the residential schools and hospitals and the reservations to try out new drugs. You know, I've talked to the medical people who did it. I've talked to the people who survived it, whose relatives died from it. So you realize this is kind of an ongoing thing. It's not long past history. It's continuing. And you know, I often say if you let it happen to your neighbor, it's going to happen to you next. And I think we often see a lot of evidence of that, right?
And the petrochemical pharma industry is doing it, forcing this upon the entire population right now. Everything is about sterilization
Right.
and making people sick, shortening lifespans, and it's working. You know, that's what I found in my career and why I sort of jumped the fence and started speaking out about certain things and doing things different. So, you know, our audience again is very educated. We understand there's the large components of eugenics, of economics, control, of course. In your experiences, there seemed to be something much more sinister belying all of this, you know, on a deeper spiritual sense, like this is a war of a different type.
I've always felt in my gut and had increasing evidence about this. It's a form of energy and soul captivation that goes on. And it's at so many different levels. Like any government needs people cowed. And the best way to do that is you harm them as a child. And that's why the conviction rate for child rape is so low. Do you know that in Canada, they've changed the law so that it's mandatory sentencing for child rape is only 6 months in prison? Wow. It's more of a crime to own a marijuana plant than it is to rape a child, because like genocide, the torture of children is endemic to our culture, and it's a tool of church and state. It always has been. So once you realize that, you begin to, your whole perception of society starts to shift. And but that's at one level. It was very lucrative. There was a lot of money to be made, and still is. And also, I had several experiences as a minister, and then after I got booted out of the church, of actual exorcisms, which I mean in a genuine way, not cases which are often the case of schizophrenia or mass hysteria or something like that, but actual. The first one I did was on Vancouver Island, you know, in a Native community, and this was a genuine case of spiritual possession. And I don't relate this story much because, you know, people often find it hard to believe, but the body of this young boy was actually changing in front of us, and the energy in the room, you could feel something very palpable. When this entity finally left it, I had this image of it being kind of a long, tentacly, spiky thing, and it kind of went like that at us, and it got me right here, right above the heart. And this was right before I was fired. And after that, I had to go through a lot of kind of personal cleansing to get this thing out that it had implanted in me. It's kind of like I don't know what the name is, you probably know, like a form of this energetic implant of some kind, aimed at my heart. And when this shaman who was helping me cleanse, you know, we went into sweat lodging and the whole bit, fasting that for many weeks. He said, it happened for a reason, Kevin. He said, so you have an insight into that world. And after that, my sense of that other reality, that kind of the thin veil, as my Irish ancestors called it, right, the veil between the worlds, it lessened for me. And I was able to, people say, how do you survive in this work for so long? It's by having that sense that it is part of there's a kind of a spiritual counterpart to this that's going on. And it has to do with a thing that is eating the human race from the inside out. And it's helped a lot by the technology now. And the level of fear and disorientation, dissociation going on in the population that gets worse the higher you climb up in the power structure. But we're under assault in a major way. And, you know, that's why I say to people, you always need to not get stuck on a particular issue, realize it's a manifestation of something else that we can all get in touch with and aware of with the right discipline, by staying in nature, by staying near children and animals and our own innocence, right? And that's why part of our movement is to get people out of the cities, especially children, get them into land-based communities. I wrote another book where we go into what self-governance means, sovereignty, and how we need spiritual, political, personal sovereignty to really not simply protest the evil, but get out of it altogether and create something new. And so I think it's an exciting time in the human race. It's a chance to have a new kind of revolution at every level where we're finally free of these malevolent influences that have corrupted us for so long, right?
Well, that evil needs our life force to feed it. And if
Yeah.
we withdraw, and, anything with an intense focus, through our own attention, purposeful or otherwise, does create energetic events, and some that actually take form that in my
Yeah.
business we called them entities.
Right.
So, Mike, you were about to say something there, I believe. You're muted.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that almost that entity sounded like a Lovecraftian sort of. Is it Cthulhu? Which is it has the tentacles, and I mean there are many historical accounts of that exact entity that is extremely powerful, and it's almost like an egregore, right? That I believe they are trying to. And Rudolf Steiner talked about the war of all against all. And it's sort of like, I think, with the technology in the cities and the entire technological overlay of this media landscape on everybody's little black screens, they are trying to project that consciousness into reality. And so, of course, I was thinking about when we came on today about trafficking and how horrendous that is, but in a way where the technology is going with like the real ID now, or excuse me, the digital ID they're pushing in Europe and the UK and all of this, I think the goal is to have us all traffic ourselves.
Right.
And we're trafficking ourselves in a way that's an entire egregoric energetic overlay that we are now either subconsciously or not, but we are opting in versus them even having to be occulted anymore. Right.
Right. And that psychology of people who are being exterminated. People often say, how come you had 1,000 people lined up at railway cars guarded by only two guys with guns and they all dutifully went on? Well, that's what we all do every day, unless you consciously say, no, I'm going to fight to the death now, right? And to oppose this thing. And one of the ways we did that, like there's a part B to the exorcism story, because you might have remember the account of when I went to Rome in 2009 and I did an exorcism outside the Vatican. And it didn't start that way. I was invited there and I was going to do a ceremony for the children who had been killed by the Catholic Church. And I brought soil from the graves of some of these native children. And I'm standing there in St. Peter's Square. And it shows you ignorance is bliss, because I didn't realize that if you try to do any kind of ceremony there, you get instantly arrested by the Vatican police and the Roman police. But I was standing there in my regalia with the stuff, and they weren't bothering me. They were walking by me like I was invisible. And I called out, this. I realized, okay, we need to call it this entity, right? Because when you get it to name itself and you expose it to the light of day, it loses its power. It comes out of the shadows, right? And I did that. And the next morning, a tornado hits Rome, first one in 48 years. And that same week, the first stories broke in the European press about Pope Benedict Ratzinger ordering bishops to conceal, these crimes by priests and everything. Part of the policy in the Catholic Church to do that, right? Not tell the police. It's a criminal conspiracy. But that came out for the first time in the press that very same week. And that's no coincidence, because when you're at that kind of juncture, you can open up this thing, right? And it hasn't stopped. It hasn't closed since then, right? 15 years later, it's still, the effect of that is still ongoing. So I think we have great power to do good that acts through us. And if you stay, clear of mind, pure of heart, and strong of will, right? Those three ingredients make us unbeatable. And it's just a matter of getting people on board to realize that and uniting in that purpose, right?
Earlier, when we were speaking, you threw out a term that I hadn't heard before. It was the ninth tier or sphere,
Circle.
related to the. I'm sorry, what was that?
The ninth circle.
Oh, ninth circle in the Vatican. So, could you elaborate on that a bit?
Well, it's the term in Latin is nonos perfidio, which actually means the ninth betrayal, and it's taken from the poem "The Inferno" by Dante Alighieri, the Italian
Hmm.
poet. If you've read the Inferno, you see it's like this pilgrim's progress down through the 9 levels of hell. And the ninth circle of hell is where Satan resides in this frozen lake, along with the souls of anyone who's betrayed a sacred trust, like the trust of a child. So the idea, very much based on the Catholic Mass, is that the blood and body of the innocent will redeem you, give you eternal life, whether it's Christ or a child, right?
Hmm.
So these satanic masses are very parallel, and I think can overlap a lot with the Catholic Mass, because it's Catholic doctrine says you're literally consuming the body and blood of Christ. It isn't a symbol like to Protestants, but to Catholics, it's the literal. It's a ritual cannibalism. So it's an easy crossover to then get in the ninth circle and realize, well, we have infinite power, and that's what the participants really believe. There's reference to the ninth circle going back to the time when the Jesuits were formed in the 1500s, because they used it as a tool to control popes and rulers all over Europe. Anne-Marie van Bienberg and Toos Nienhuis are two witnesses who were raised in the ninth circle, and they described how you have to kill your eldest child, not just kill them, but do other horrible things to them in order to elevate up through the cult. But once you do that, you got to take your other children, and they're trained as people to entrap others. So, for example, they would invite judges. Mark Rutte, the head of NATO, who once the president of the Netherlands, he was likely entrapped in the same way, possibly. Invited to a dinner, and then there's a child stretched on an altar, and it's all being filmed because they're tied into the snuff industry as well. And this is, one of the ways it operates, and this is what's been documented for the last number of months by this new criminal court in Europe. That's going to be coming out very soon.
Now, there are alleged prophecies about the last pope, which was supposedly prior to Frankie even. Can you speak on that at all?
It's really part of the whole kind of befuddling industry around
Hmm.
the Church of Rome, because you hear people talk a lot about unum sanctum, which was a
Hmm.
papal a papal bull, and I love that term, papal bulls. But it comes from bulla, which is Latin word meaning a stamp. So it's
Hmm.
like when the College of Cardinals passes a so-called law, and unum sanctum says there's no salvation outside the Church of Rome. Everyone is subject to it. Well, the reason they did that is it was in direct response to attempts within the church to reduce the power of the Pope, because traditionally the Pope had no authority. And in fact, in the real world, and I go into that in detail in this book about what is the Vatican, why it shouldn't be at the UN. It's not a state. It has its own statutes, but they only apply to people within it. And in fact, the Vatican Bank was set up by Mussolini, the fascist dictator, and so it shouldn't have any authority whatsoever outside Italy. And yet everyone treats the Vatican and the Holy See at the UN as some kind of legitimate body. It isn't. It's what there's a good legal scholar in England, Geoffrey Robertson, and he wrote a book about this, and he calls the Vatican a Santa Claus state, where governments, because they want Catholic votes and financial help from the Vatican, which is a huge money industry, they pretend that the Vatican has legitimacy. So the other day there was a bishop who stood up at the UN, and they switch hats. When they want to have protection from the law and do whatever they want, they pretend they're a church, and then when they want to speak at the UN, they pretend they're a government. And politicians let them get away with that. So that's why we say it's up to the people to say, look, we've got to put an end to this whole fiction. You can't kill children just because you wear a robe, right? I mean, it's you would think it's common sense, legally and morally, but it's amazing how the power religion has to frighten people, even atheists, to think, well, maybe they're in a different category. Maybe we shouldn't judge them. The guy in the robe. You know,
Kevin, I have two questions actually. One being around, do you have any evidence that there is a black pope and these, the three different popes, which we hear a lot about in our circles, the gray, the black, and the public facing pope? And then what role do the Jesuits play here? Do they have, are they an acting body that's sort of working within the behind the scenes to maintain this power structure within all these different political circles and these elite circles?
well, yeah, the Jesuits were set up in the 1500s by Ignatius Loyola, who was a mercenary soldier from Spain. And their first object was to assassinate Queen Elizabeth in England. She was the only Protestant ruler opposing the Vatican. In fact, my name Annett, we were French Huguenots who had to flee France. We were given sanctuary in England. Anyone with a French-sounding name is usually Huguenot origin. But the Jesuits functioned as, kind of an assassination army. But also they accumulated a lot of wealth. As a military power, they did things like arm in Canada. They armed the Huron to fight the Mohawk in the French-English War that happened there in America, right? And so, but in doing so, they accumulated a lot of money like the Templars did. And you find them in a lot of the banks, like Citibank, HSBC, Bank of America. They're all heavily Jesuit. Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., Jesuit established. I mean, it's the tentacles go everywhere of that. But the thing to understand is that people don't really understand what they're dealing with when you talk about the Church of Rome. It's not a Christian church when you look at its doctrine. It's based on emperor worship. Even the terms that are used for the Pope, like Pontifex Maximus, the great bridge between heaven and earth, one guy. Well, to a Christian, you just read your Bible, that's supposed to be Christ. But in fact, the Pope has replaced, and matter of fact, the term they adopt, Vicari Christi, means the one who replaces Christ. So in effect, it's a neo-pagan religion with a Christian veneer on it that says one man has authority over everybody else. Not God, but a man. He's being elevated above everybody. So that's why, once you're befuddled, you get rid of that fog, you're less befuddled, and you realize, no, it's a criminal agency, the oldest one in the world, and there's been various estimates about this, but somewhere around 3/4 or more of the world's bank deposits end up going through the Vatican Bank and the Bank of International Settlements in Geneva. They're extraterritorial, they're outside anyone's jurisdiction. And what government or criminal enterprise or corporation would not want access to that money? The thing that this present case is finding out is that a lot of the Vatican money is going east to China in the so-called BRIC alliance. And it's interesting that Russell Nelson, the head of the Mormons, was just found dead. The Mormons have almost as much assets as the Vatican Bank, if you can believe it, 167 billion in fixed assets. And Russell Nelson was part of the Mormon old guard who didn't want that money going to China and the Vatican. But in fact, and Charlie Kirk, who was killed in Utah, there's evidence that in fact the Santa Alianza, which is the Vatican Assassination Bureau, and a group called the Danites, who are the equivalent of the Mormon Church, they were involved in both of those deaths. It's like when you look into these people around the Ninth Circle, it's like the final scene in Hamlet where there's bodies all over the stage. Bodies keep appearing all the time, right? Whenever you try to, investigate the Vatican at all. Like the guy, remember John Paul I, who died in office after 30 days in 1978 because he was investigating the Vatican Bank. Every magistrate, every cop, everyone investigating him, and all of his associates, they're all dead within a year. Car bombs, assassinations. So you're dealing with a very dangerous body when you're talking about the Church of Rome, but they do that deliberately to get everybody intimidated, and we shouldn't be, because we've shown how they are vulnerable, right? That was a long answer, but I hope I answered your question to someone.
And then just the idea of the other popes, is there any credence to that?
Yeah, no, not from what I've ever seen. Where do these stories come from? That's the first question to ask. So the Pope, even the early popes, the first few centuries of the Church of Rome, they didn't recognize one guy in Rome as the ultimate authority. That came later in the Middle Ages. Originally, there was a pope in Alexandria, Antioch, and Rome. He was just one of three, right? But as power concentrated, who led the colonial era, right? It was the Vatican authorizing everybody to conquer the world. If you weren't a Catholic, you didn't have the right to live. As a matter of fact, we had a gross example of that when Pope Francis, the so-called liberal pope, do you remember he came to America and spoke to the both houses of Congress in 2017? He beatified, okay, so that's turned into a saint, this guy Junipero Serra, who was there in California in the 1700s. He worked to death over 100,000 natives on his plantations. And Bergoglio, Pope Francis, says, "We are inspired by his zeal." That was a direct quote. So liberal or conservative, you still have the same doctrine. If you're not a Catholic, you're in a different standard of humanity. We can do whatever we want to you, basically, until you're a baptized Catholic. And that's created a lot of genocide and war over the years. And people think that somehow in the past. It isn't, and that's what these court cases were conducting are proving, right?
Yeah, Junipero Serra, his name is very prominent in the Bay Area in parochial schools, highways named after him. Michael and I, by the way, are both products of the parochial school system. And all I can say is, well, growing up in a Catholic Italian family and, 12 years of parochial school, boy, the indoctrination goes so deep.
Oh, yeah.
So, kiss the ring, Bear. Kiss the ring. I'm literally in a town right now that has a mission here in Santa Barbara, where they have where the Chumash Indians were enslaved. And actually where we're based, Kevin, on the border of California and Oregon, where our farm is and stuff, the town of Crescent City actually has the second worst slaughter of Native Americans in the history of the United States. And those people are still in charge of that town. Those families are now 3 or 4 generations and are still running the show. And I personally believe that the problems of that area will not resolve until we clean up the spiritual resonance of that horrendous slaughter of innocents. And those people need to be taken, those families need to leave power, because if you go through, and there's a prison now, of course, there, and there's just a pallor of sort of darkness still within the land. And I think that's the case for a lot of North America, right? You have this, I think there's a lot of also the natives, and I know this from many stories, they put hexes and they put all sorts of, curses on the land too. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so where do you see this going right now with this court case? And also, so these are tribunals, or could you explain a little bit on the, say, maybe on the common law side, or how this is working? Because this isn't like The Hague, right? This isn't anything that's actual being recognized by the UN or anything. This is literally citizen-led, right?
Yeah, and it's even more than that. During the Vietnam War, Bertrand Russell did this thing called the Russell Commission into the, probably remember that, into the independent investigation of the Vietnam War. It helped launch the Pentagon Papers whole thing, right? It has a ripple effect when people take that investigation into their own hands. Under international law, it's called a tribunal of conscience. So any group of citizens can investigate an issue, and they even conduct their own courts. And provided you follow, basic rules of evidence, due process, all this stuff, right, that you'd learn under common law. And the verdict of such a court can be acted on by other courts, so other warrants can be issued. That's why when we forced Ratzinger and those cardinals out of office, Ratzinger didn't leave the Vatican until the day he died. He went out in a box. Okay, so he knew he could face arrest, that a court anywhere might have issued an arrest warrant against him, right? Well, because, popes like to travel around, show the flag, but no, he never left the Vatican because he knew he was lawfully convicted by our court. So that's what we teach people in these training workshops we do and on our books and films, how to set that up and how it has legitimacy under international law. Now, that's just because it has theoretical legitimacy doesn't mean it's going to be supported, because in practice, any agency tied to the UN or any government is tied into Vatican money. I mean, I remember the first time I went to Italy in 2009, just before that exorcism I did. I had dinner with one of the senators who had invited me in the Democratic Party, Furio Colombo, his name was. And he said, you know, what you don't understand about the church is that the mafia, the government, the banks, the church, they're all the same people. And they only have one concern, their money. And the way to get that is to get absolute power. He described how every political party in Italy got Vatican money, just like every major political party in the world does, right? So you're not going to get any of those guys to admit that what we're doing is legitimate. Google and YouTube and that, owned by, the last time I checked, GlaxoSmithKline, the British big pharma industry. So, I mean, the connections, the corporate control of the media and governments is so absolute. You got to rely on just yourselves and your own awareness of things and your own media, like you guys, to get this out. And most importantly, get people to act. I'm part of the court case we're working on now is there's a group of Catholics who approached me in Buffalo, New York, and they have evidence. One of these women, Sue Moreno, her brother, Joe Moreno, was a priest who was found dead, 2 bullets to the back of the head, after he had gathered evidence about child trafficking in his diocese, and he was about to take it to Timothy Dolan, who's one of the cardinals named in our indictment. He's the one Trump wanted in as Pope. Dolan is dirty right up to his eyebrows, and apparently he put the hit out on this priest because he had all this evidence. He was going to go to the FBI with it about a very extensive child trafficking across Lake Erie and Lake Ontario into southern Canada. And we're documenting that, of course, but he was an inconvenient priest, 2 bullets to the back of the head. Police still say it's somehow suicide, where you can shoot yourself twice in the back of the head. I mean, it's ludicrous, but that's what you're dealing with when you're...
And do they use the mob for that? Because we know there's obviously direct mafia connections, right?
Well, in here, actually, I describe a lot of the major mafia actors and their connection to various popes. Chicago is a notorious center for that. Cardinal Cody was a member of the local Italian mafia family. And so, you know, the mafia and the Catholic Church are one and the same very much. But yeah, and so we have the names of all these people in that, and it's just a matter of acting on the evidence and the knowledge you have, right?
And a lot of our prominent politicians here, you know, like Hillary is alleged, her father, who is supposedly in upholstering business, was the heir apparent to Capone in Chicago. And then you have Pelosi, who's the daughter of the mob boss of Baltimore. So, yeah, you can't make this stuff up.
Well, it's like what Balzac meant when he said, behind every great fortune stands a crime.
Yeah.
I think it was the DuPonts and the Harrimans, you know, the big American millionaire family. They got their start in the opium trade, just like the British Empire did. At one point, a third of all their revenue in the British Empire came from Chinese opium trade, right? That's why they had the opium wars.
Yep.
So, but I mean, you dig deep enough, you find this everywhere, right?
And the opium wars continue with fentanyl here at home. So
exactly.
Yep. I think great, Kevin, you also made a fantastic point. And this is something we continually stress in our shows and to our community, which is about, you know, this idea of sovereignty, and really the only true sovereign is the Lord Creator, you know, the God, who has given us the free will to act here. But this idea that of getting out of this false left-right dichotomy of voting, and this idea that any quote unquote government or any actor has any sort of authority over us. The only entity with authority is the true sovereign, our creator. And so this is something that I think is an important to keep covering. And we'll actually have Etienne Bear, right? He's coming back on, Howard, who's done amazing work at showing just the outright scam that is government. And once again, with this latest presidential election, we had everybody falling for Trump again. And, you know, and I think that is going to be one of the greatest, revolutions of mind that we've never seen really in known history, is how do we evolve out of this sort of this idea of having a government control us, whether that be a theocracy, a democracy, an oligarchy, etc. Where do you see that solution sort of unfolding, and how can that, I mean, we talk about anarchy, we talk about voluntarism, we talk about agorism in terms of the economics. Where do you see that unfolding in the next, I don't know, 10, 20 years?
I think that is the only alternative to global corporate fascism, or what we call the corporatocracy. And that's really one of the questions we try to answer in this book. And it's why we wrote it. 5 of us wrote this. And there's one thing, I think Tom Jefferson said, that without a virtuous citizenry, there can be no republic. So by virtuous, he meant not just personally in terms of your moral qualities, but your ability to take responsibility for society and your neighbors. You know, not leave. And there was a great book written, Democracy in America, by Alexis de Tocqueville. He was a French aristocrat in the 1830s. He kind of tootled around America, and he has some really interesting observations about Americans. He said, America will be very prone to tyranny because everyone is so obsessed with their individual rights, tending their farm, whatever, that they leave public affairs to a few men. And that will lead naturally to oligarchy. And, they chucked out this whole European notion of, hereditary rule and hierarchy and that. But the downside of that is that you get what you have now. Everyone's atomized, and Mortebellin will be saved, right? It's a hard thing to get people to rediscover their innate sovereignty, which means thinking in terms of we, not just I, and being responsible, and that's that sense of taking responsibility. It's a big hurdle to get over, personally and politically, right?
Well, it requires taking a risk as well.
Yep.
Now, you've really stuck your neck out and done that and paid the price for it. And it's really every individual has to someday, I think, make a choice. Are they going to continue to comply, ask for permission,
Right.
and all the things that feed the beast? And there's, one of the things that we're involved with is, participating in educational events and some of the things that you're speaking on as far as, offshoots of common law and ways to work and thrive and do business outside of the system. But from personal experience, sometimes that does come with risk, but the more of us that do it, then, that's the only protection that we can be afforded.
Well, and I'll give you another example. One of the offshoots of this whole campaign we've done for 30 years is once Queen Elizabeth was convicted of genocide back in 2013, Canada had no legitimate head of state. So 2 years later in Winnipeg, a couple of hundred delegates formed the Republic of Canada. So we formed a sovereign republic outside Crown jurisdiction. And we've had ups and down successes, but one of the first things we do is we get 12 people to sign a charter, local charter, to establish an assembly, and out of that a common law court. And that assembly can start passing local laws. So we did that all during the COVID and beyond. We passed laws to keep tax money in the community, to do any measure that people wanted. And it worked time and again. But when it came to enforcing it and to saying to the world, okay, we have our own laws now, these laws in our community are legitimate, we pass them, then people got cold feet. And, some of these assemblies collapsed, others are continuing, but it's getting people to see it's a lifelong struggle. And your children and grandchildren are going to be doing this fight. And we need to create the alternative communities, assemblies, courts, everything you have in a grassroots republic, right? And that to me is a real challenge now, to get people to act on that, right?
Yeah. And at the foundation, it's really a spiritual evolution of sorts. Kevin, we're coming up on the hour here, and I could talk to you forever. And this is so great making an initial contact, and we'd love to stay in touch with you and get updated every so often as far as, how your work is progressing. But in closing, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to cover? And also, can you just give our audience all the best links for your work where they can find your books and such?
Well, the main link's murderbydecree.com, Republic of Kanata, Kanata.org. I'm at angelfire101 at protonmail.com. And on Amazon, you can see all my books. I've written 28 of them now on all these and other topics. I would say to people, the most important thing is to act on what you know, where you are. And, you know, that doing, you know, I remember when I forget who said this, but maybe I said it at some point. But the important thing is to do something and then see what happens, because that's how you learn on the go. You learn through action, and you know, it's like your best teacher is your most recent mistake in a way, right? But you have to have the humility and the consistency. You say, okay, we've learned from that. We won't do that. We'll do this next time. Connect, and most importantly, unite with people who are understanding what we're all talking about here, right? So I'm actually going to be in Europe, but also back through America in the fall and in the spring. And I'd love to come by and, you know, hold meetings and give talks. And that's what we do now most of the time. So, yeah, just anyone wants to contact me, or you can line up more interviews, I'd be happy to with your folks.
Wonderful.
This has been fantastic. And yeah, you make a great point, Kevin. It's about using our will force and in all the little steps towards a more self-determined reality, right? So it's not like we all are going to go out there and do what you're doing, but spreading the word to your neighbors, getting involved with decentralized systems, starting a little podcast, you know, praying and meditating, and getting off the mainstream systems of control, whether that be quit your Netflix account, whatever. Like, you know, it's all those little steps, right? And having the grace and understanding to know that we're all in this together. And as we always say on these shows, there are higher powers involved. And every time that there's like an alchemical energetic that takes place when you decide to initiate your will force towards this goal of a higher, you know, place of love and empowerment, where they'll come down. Like, I've got these wings behind me here at in this hotel room, but it's
I thought
kind of
those were your wings here, Michael.
I feel like I'm growing wings right now, Bear. But no, that's like the angelic forces or, you know, whatnot are here to support us if we just take the step in the right direction, right? So,
Could I just add one little point that
yeah.
I've learned over the years that people only change when they have to. And then it's usually to get back to where they were. But I had to. I didn't do this out of a good intention. My life was being destroyed. My family was ripped apart. I couldn't work. My friends were being killed. I realized I had to do this or I'd die. And my children would suffer for it and everything. So when you have to fight back, that's why Sun Tzu says never force your enemy into a corner, because then they fight that much harder. We're getting to the point now, more and more of us are realizing that we have to, or we don't have a future, our children don't have a future. And I would leave that urgency with people, that this is, it may not, the tide may not have reached your door yet, but one day it will. And you got to be prepared beforehand, before that moment comes, right?
Yeah.
Well said.
Beautiful, Kevin. Well, thanks so much for your time today. I'll make sure all the links are in the show notes below, guys. Go support Kevin. Buy those books. I'll also add the books in our book list, so you guys can support both Alfa Vedic and Kevin's work that way. So that's just alfavedic.com/book list. And thanks again, guys, for joining us on the live chat. Thanks, Kevin, so much.
Thank you.
And remember, get outside, get your feet in the dirt, go plant something, go for a hike, show Mother Nature some love, go dive into the ocean, hike in the woods. Kevin, you were saying that, right? Like, it's such an easy solution, but go back to nature. It's just a profound way to just get back into touch with who we are and why we're here. So,
Amen. Okay.
Love you guys. Okay, we'll see you
guys.
next week. Thanks so
Okay.
much. Peace.